I'm extremely delighted to introduce our second speaker today, Elissa Marder, who joins us from Emory University, where she is professor of French and comparative literature. Elissa Marder is a specialist in deconstruction psychoanalysis, French literature, and literary theory, whose work has reshaped how readers of Baudelaire, Freud, Benjamin, and Derrida approach each of these authors. In addition to her position at Emory, Elissa is an international fellow of the London Graduate School and a professor of philosophy at the European Graduate School. She is a founding member of the Emory Psychoanalytic Studies program and served as its director from 2001 to 2006. Elissa has published a number of books, including Dead Time, Temporal Disorders in the Wake of Modernity, Baudelaire and Flaubert, with Stanford University Press in 2001, The Mother in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Psychoanalysis, Photography, Deconstruction, with Fordham in 2012, and most recently, a co-edited volume of Yale French Studies entitled Time for Baudelaire, Poetry, Theory, History in 2014. She's the editor of Literature and Psychoanalysis, Open Questions, a special issue of Paragraph, as well as the author of numerous essays and articles on diverse topics in literature, literary theory, feminism, film, photography, and psychoanalysis, including subjects such as Blade Runner, Frankenstein, Freud, The Myth of Pandora, Walter Benjamin, Jacques Derrida, and Hélène Cixous. Elissa is currently working on 3 projects, including a short book provocatively titled The Dream and the Guillotine on psychophotography and other fixations, a book named Poetry by Other Means, Baudelaire's Afterlife and the Late Writings of Walter Benjamin, for which I'm particularly excited. And lastly, one entitled Revolutionary Perversions, Literary Sex Acts, 1789 to 1848, which explores how the traumatic aftermath of the French Revolution reappears in many canonical texts of the first half of the 19th century in the form of some sort of perverse and sexual secret. Today, Elissa will be presenting her paper, Still Unborn. Please join me in welcoming her.
So thank you so much to Anna Rosenthal for organizing this conference, and also to the editors of Geschlecht III, Rodrigo Teresa, Jeffrey Bennington, and Katie Chenoweth, and to the translators, although I haven't seen it, of the new English edition, Rodrigo Teresa and Katie Chenoweth, or Katie Chenoweth and Rodrigo Teresa. This paper's in 4 parts, so you can follow along, I guess. And thanks also to Texas AMU for having us more generally. 1, the mother of language. In the final 2 lines of a poem by Georg Trakl that Heidegger does not gloss and may not have known, the sound of dark summer cymbals announces the appearance of a feminine stranger, die Fremde, who appears on the decaying stair. Ein Klang von dunklen Zümbeln des Sommers, wenn die Fremde auf der verfallenen Stiege erscheint. I begin with the clanging sound that signals the arrival of this feminine stranger, seemingly suspended in time and space on a decrepit stairway, going neither up nor down, to announce that I am here as a stranger. To my knowledge, Heidegger never uses the feminine form when writing about the stranger. And in declaring myself a stranger, I certainly do not presume to speak from the position of the stranger within Heidegger's reading of Trakl, but rather to alert you to the fact that, as a stranger to Heidegger's thinking, what I say may have a slightly odd ring to it, a funny-sounding foreign accent, a patois of Derridian French, inflected here and there with a soupçon of psychoanalysis and a feminist twang. Stranger or not, if I'm nonetheless drawn to speak in this place, this collective reading of Geschlecht III, it's because many of the questions that Derrida addresses in the Geschlecht series lay down the essential groundwork for much of his thinking on topics and texts that are closer to the neighborhoods I'm accustomed to frequent. And these include Derrida's encounters with Hélène Cixous and Francis Ponge, his complex and ambivalent engagement with psychoanalysis, his trenchant critique of the philosophical tradition's consistent failure to account for the co-implication of species difference and sexual difference, and finally, and most saliently here, his call for the necessity of rethinking the relation between the ontological question of birth on the one hand and the anthropological place of the mother on the other. And I should just sort of mention here in passing that even though I don't do it, I think one could, it's implied, one can relate what Derrida says in Geschlecht III to his unpublished work on the mother, on the seminar of the mother. So that's in the background. And actually on surrogate mothers, on mère porteuse, and the technicity of surrogate mothers. So what is the place of the mother and in Heidegger and in Derrida's reading of Heidegger in the Geschlechter? The word Mutter never appears in Unterwegs zur Sprache. It does, however, appear in a striking formulation from the 1960 essay Sprache und Heimat that Derrida himself quoted more than once, although never in any of the Geschlechter. Die Mundart ist nicht nur die Sprache der Mutter, sondern zugleich und zuvor die Mutter der Sprache. Now there is something particularly strange about this Heideggerian formula about the relationship between dialect, idiom, and the mother. As Heidegger reminds us, Mundart, which is variously translated into English as either dialect or idiom, literally means manner of the mouth. And the word retains a primordial relation to the sonorous, sensuous quality of language and to the body. Mundart is receptivity to the language in which we are born. It comes from the mother and is carried in the mouth. And the strangest word in Heidegger's bipartite expression, dialect is not merely the language of the mother, but at the same time, and still more so, the mother of language, is the word that is apparently the most familiar, mother. The word mother appears twice in the sentence and seems to have two distinct and divergent meanings. To approach the sentence, we must think both about each of these two instances of the word Mutter and about the difference, the Unterschied, that both joins and separates them. In the first phrase, the word Mutter appears to belong to the realm of facticity. Die Sprache der Mutter, the speech of the mother, is language as it is spoken by a particular mother who inhabits a particular position and place in the world. Even if that place cannot be located according to geography or nationality, the expression nonetheless presupposes the existence of something like a particular mother in a particular place. When, however, Heidegger reverses the relation between mother and language in the second phrase, so that dialect is now the mother of language, rather than the language of the mother, we have moved from the ontic to the ontological. Once Mundart becomes the mother of language, Heidegger is no longer speaking about a particular being that exists in the sensible world. And in its second iteration, the familiar word mother becomes unfamiliar. In The Retreat of Metaphor, after quoting Heidegger's sentence about the Mundart, Derrida observes, quote, "Far from knowing before what a mother is, such a reversal alone allows us, perhaps, to approach the essence of maternity." Derrida also slips a brief parenthetical reference to these lines by Heidegger into Given Time that establishes a relation linking the various different idioms for giving in different natural languages and the gift of different languages to the essential givenness of language itself. He writes, even before speaking of some gift or division, partage of languages, it is not insignificant that one speaks of languages as a given, as a system that is necessarily there before us, that we receive from a fundamental passivity. The idiom, or the dialect, Mundart, says Heidegger, speaking of J.P. Hebel, is not only the maternal tongue, but also, indeed, in the first place, the mother of the tongue. Language, like the gestation that precedes our birth, or that is carried out in the body of the mother, is before us. It is the given that comes before all other divisions, partage, and before the possibility of any other gift. And it is this primordial given that makes all other gifts and all other divisions, including the principle of economy and the two strikes of Geschlecht, possible. Heidegger never uses the word mother in Die Sprache im Gedicht or in any of the other essays in Unterweg zur Sprache. However, as Derrida points out, in both Geschlecht IV and in Geschlecht III, Heidegger draws extensively on the language of gestation, childbearing, and childbirth in several of his language essays, and most especially in the essay called Language, Die Sprache. In Geschlecht IV, Heidegger's ear, Derrida picks up on the way Heidegger relates the verb tragen, meaning to bear or to carry, and that came up in Rodrigo's sense of the girl who bears or who carries. So that bearing or carrying, to several idiomatic meanings of austragen, including bringing to term, in the sense of carrying a child to term. And Derrida provides the following gloss and a commentary on this famous passage from Language, in which Heidegger establishes a connection between the gesture of gestation and the way things thing the world. Things, as they unfold their thing being, bring into the world, carry the world to the world. Our old language calls such carrying to term austragen, behren, whence the words gebären, give birth, carry to term, deliver, bear children, all gestation, and Gebärde, gesture, deed, behavior, how one carries oneself, bearing, comportment. In unfolding their thing being, they, here I risk a neologism, jest or guest world. They carry it during gestation, carrying it to term, giving it a comportment, a countenance, a figure, a face, a gesture. And although Derrida remains highly attentive to the significance that Heidegger gives to the extended, as he calls it, family of words that relate tragen to austragen, as far as I know, he does not explicitly interrogate the fact that there is a strange overdetermination between this particular philological example about bearing and childbearing and Heidegger's very gesture of appealing to what is carried, as it were, in our old language. So that even to hearken back to our old language has to presuppose that what the old language does is gestate or carry for us to be able to hear it now. So in order to be here, so I won't gloss that too much, but in our old language as a way of opening up a path to thinking. The very gesture of appealing to our old language presupposes that our old language is capable of bearing or carrying something. In other words, some thinking of carrying and or gestation must come before and make possible any gathering of words into any kind of an etymological family. And Derrida uses variations of the phrase family of words extensively throughout Geschlecht III. But what exactly is the relation between word families and family words? For the moment, we can say that word families relate to that which is carried by the idiom. The word mother, mère, appears in only one place in the entire text of Geschlecht III. In the final paragraph of Derrida's written text, just before the quotation from Trakl with which the book closes, Derrida concludes his reading of Die Sprache im Gedicht by suggesting that all of Heidegger's seductive claims, and these include a non-binary thinking of sexual difference, a non-anthropocentric thinking of species difference, a non-vulgar thinking of historical time, and a non-nationalistic thinking of the relation between language and place, all of those claims are undercut by the unique place that Heidegger accords to the brother's song at the end of his reading of Trakl. And according to Derrida, Heidegger's choice of the brother as the only family figure capable of gathering sexual difference and species difference into ein Geschlecht, one race, sex, generation, is neither innocent nor accidental. Insisting that Heidegger could not have chosen any other family member to gather the song, Derrida makes a list of all the other family figures, le père, la mère, le fils et la fille, and claims that the underlying logic of Heidegger's account of Geschlecht, despite appearances to the contrary, dictates that all the other family figures function purely as stand-ins or representatives for the brother. And in the final lines of Geschlecht III, after having followed Heidegger's circuitous path through Trockel's poetry that leads up to the brothers' song, Derrida ends his reading of Heidegger's essay on an apparently critical, albeit equivocal note. And Derrida seems to be suggesting that if only the brother can break with the family structure to become the bearer of the promise of an emancipatory future, that fraternal promise is itself born and carried by and bound to the determining language of natality, naturality, and nationality. He writes, figure de la patrie ou au-delà de la patrie dans la fratrie. Natalité, naturalité, nationalité, ou le contraire ou sont au-delà. Question que je laisse suspendue. So immediately after pronouncing these three Latinate words, natality, naturality, nationality, Derrida adds the following caveat, or the opposite, or it's beyond. Question I leave suspended. And the question of the place of the mother, the word appears for the very first and last time here, and that of the Latinate trio, natality, naturality, and nationality, come together in the question that Derrida leaves suspended in this final paragraph of Geschlecht III. But everything that we have said thus far about language, the idiom, the mother, and the gestational resonances of Tragen and Austragen, given all of that, can one consider the mother to be simply a member of the family, another member of the family of the Geschlecht, like any mother, and how does the thinking through the language of gestation inflect the status of the mother in relation to the two strikes of Geschlecht? So in other words, I'm saying that there's both a positing and an erasure of something like this undecidable status of the mother that can't just either be anthropological or something else, but that there is this maternal function happening in here, or there couldn't even be a strike of the first Geschlecht. So in order to think about this question, we'll take another look at how the place of the mother underwrites both Heidegger's reading of place and Derrida's reading of Heidegger. Part 2, Derrida's third ear. There is something strange about the situation of the book that was recently published under the title Geschlecht III. Its publication comes both too early and too late. Too early because even though the book's editors have meticulously reconstituted the text of Geschlecht III on the basis of Derrida's repeated verbal and written announcements that described a text of 100 or so written pages, as Derrida himself never completed that promised work, Geschlecht III remains, and will always remain, unfinished. Similarly, one might also observe that the publication of Geschlecht III comes too late. Unlike Geschlechts I, II, and IV, all of which were published during Derrida's lifetime, the posthumous publication of Geschlecht III does not merely constitute a break in the numerical sequence of the other Geschlechter, it also lends it an untimely, ghostly quality. And the peculiar situation of this published but unfinished work is accentuated by two additional factors. One, despite having never published the work as promised, Derrida repeatedly and very insistently announced its future publication and incorporated brief references to it as well as extensive written summary of it in other pieces of his published writings. And most notably, at the end of Heidegger's hand, Geschlecht II, Derrida includes a detailed written sketch, as he puts it, of the major concerns of Geschlecht III that he prefaces with the following oral commentary about the current status of the future work. This last remark will have to serve as a transition to the word, the mark Geschlecht, that we ought now to have taken up in another text. I will not give this part of my lecture, which should have been titled Geschlecht III, and whose typed manuscript has been photocopied and distributed to some of you so that a discussion of it might be possible. I will confine myself then to a very cursory sketch of it. So the published text of Geschlecht II bears the Schlag, or the mark, of the unwritten Geschlecht III. The future Geschlecht III dwells within the pages of Geschlecht II like a gestating child that has not yet been brought to term. And item 2, this is back to 1 and 2 of 2 factors. The title of the now published Geschlecht III is thus doubly marked. It is both the name for this posthumous work that we are reading here together, as well as the title of a work that was promised, but was never delivered. And if I have insisted on this structure, it's because the unusual situation of the text, with its doubly marked status, written and unwritten, premature, belated, promised but never delivered, already speaks to Derrida's engagement with Heidegger in the text. Or, to put it another way, Geschlecht III is still unborn. In the perspective sketch of Geschlecht III that appears at the end of Geschlecht II, Derrida emphasizes the critical role that translation plays in his confrontation Auseinandersetzung with Heidegger. In a note to G2, Geschlecht II, Derrida calls attention to the fact that his engagement with the language of Heidegger's text happens both in translation and through translation. He writes, "Perhaps you'll be surprised to see me quoting a French translation of Heidegger in a lecture given in English. I am doing so for 2 reasons. On the one hand, in order not to erase the constraints or the chances of the idiom in which I myself work, teach, read, or write. What you are hearing right at this moment, is the translation of a text I first wrote in French. On the other hand, I thought that Heidegger's text might still be more accessible, might gain some supplementary readability by reaching us thus through a third ear. The explication Auseinandersetzung with more than one language may refine our translation, Übersetzung, of what is called the original text. I just spoke of the ear of the other as a third ear." Unquote. Derrida here invokes the term third ear to conjure up a mode of listening to the language of the other that lets itself be heard in the interstices between languages. And not uninterestingly, given the theme of the seminar from which Geschlecht III was drawn, the term third ear takes us to a passage of Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche identifies the third ear with the position of the reader who, attuned to the absence of musicality and rhythm within the national idiom, finds it to be unbearable. And Nietzsche writes, "What a torture are books written in German to a reader who has a third ear. How indignantly he stands beside the slowly turning swamp of sounds, without tune or rhythms, without dance, which Germans call a book." And here I'll just point out that this term third ear is, from Nietzsche, is where Reich got it within the psychoanalytic context, which is kind of interesting. So here, however, Derrida's appeal to reading Heidegger with a third ear involves listening with at least 3 ears across at least 3 different languages, because, as he will argue, reading Heidegger through translation actually brings us closer to Heidegger's original text rather than taking us farther away from it. I'm suggesting that this movement through translation is for Derrida a necessary step in entering the path of Heidegger's thinking. As he puts it in a note on the very first page of Geschlecht III, à chaque pas, with each step, the risque de la pensée, à chaque pas, I'm going to say, with each step, le risque de la pensée reste intimement engagé dans la langue, l'idiome et la traduction. So, with each step, the risk of thinking is intimately engaged with speech, the idiom, and translation, or with language, the idiom, and translation. It's through these three terms, language, idiom, and translation, that Derrida approaches Heidegger's essay on Hakel, Die Sprache im Gedicht, language in the poem, la parole dans le poème. And with the announcement of these three terms together, language, idiom, translation, on page 1 of Geschlecht III, Derrida has already begun to translate Heidegger's language into Derridian terms. And as we shall see in more detail later on, Derrida uses the word idiom in highly idiomatic and often idiosyncratic ways. So even if Derrida explicitly designates idiom as one of the guiding threads of his reading of Heidegger in Geschlecht III, the word itself must be read with care, as it takes on many different inflections and ramifications in this particular text and through Derrida's writings more generally. At the risk of simplification, we can say that Derrida uses the term idiom in at least three and distinct or semi-distinct but related ways. One, he uses the term to designate linguistic expressions that can be identified as belonging to a given natural language, such as German or French. In the quotation from Geschlecht II cited above, for example, when he remarks that the English translation of his lecture still bears the traces of, quote, the constraints or chances of the idiom, the word idiom refers to the range of possible expressions offered by the specific language, here French, in which the text was originally written. 2, he uses the word idiom, often modified as untranslatable idiom, to designate those expressions within a given natural language that are so bound to that language that they cannot be translated or cannot economically be translated if we take it into another language. So when, for example, Derrida glosses Heidegger's appeal to the old High German word fram to claim that the word fremd in Hakel's poems means forward to somewhere else, underway toward, rather than simply strange, Derrida observes that because the word fremd belongs so intimately to German, déjà la traduction paraît a priori illégitime, la réponse reste idiomatique, elle appartient qu'à une langue, à un certain état de la langue. Already, translation seems a priori illegitimate. The response remains idiomatic. It belongs to one language only, or to a certain state of that language. And because of that, the very act of translation threatens to lose all its legitimacy, says Derrida in Geschlecht III. But number 3, the third way that Derrida uses idiom, in addition to these two ways of understanding the idiom, however, Derrida also associates the idiom with a certain kind of singularity, something like an unsubstitutability or an irreplaceability, the unique and the secret. It is that element within language that cannot be repeated or transported because it is uniquely embodied within language. And this I have some questions about. We can talk about that, how that relates to iterability, how that's even possible. So there are some problems with that, but I insist that he insists something like that. So if we step back from the specific context of Geschlecht III for the moment, we discover in that many of his writings not primarily devoted to Heidegger, for example, in texts on Freud, on Cixous, or on the question of translation, Derrida often links this irreplaceable singularity of the idiom to the language of the dream, very specifically. In Mal d'Archives, for example, Derrida describes Hanold's obsession with Gradiva's passage as his own impossible dream to relive the, quote, lieu irremplaçable, la cendre même où l'empreinte singulière comme une signature se distingue à peine de l'impression. And I don't think I have that translated. So sorry, guys. The unreplaceable site, ashes itself, or the singular imprint, like a signature, that place, like a signature which separates itself barely from its impression. So the moment where the thing itself is the moment of the making of the impression of the foot of Gradiva in the ash. So it's that moment. It is this site, a place that is divided and haunted at the origin, that is described as the condition, la condition de singularité, l'idiome, le secret, le témoignage. So it is all of those things. Wrong room, I guess.
Yeah.
Likewise, in Freud and the Scene of Writing, Derrida invokes the idiom in the context of the embodied traces of the language of the dream. And here, in his gloss on the relations among language, the idiom, and translation, he invokes something that he calls corps verbal. And here he says, or un corps verbal, and you have the English, which was, I had to change this, I think, because the body of a word, cannot be translated or carried over into another language. It is precisely that which translation lets go of. To let go of the body, such as the essential energy of translation. And when it reinstates a body, it is poetry. In this sense, since the body of the signifier constitutes the idiom of every dream scene, the dream is untranslatable. End quote. So dream words, and this is, have a corporeal existence that resists being brought into signification, even if that corporeal existence manifests itself uniquely in a dream and as a dream, consisting of nothing other than the traces of bodies of words that have been uniquely brought into relation with one another in a time and a place that was never present. And that's the peculiarity of a dream. So that it's both kind of material in a way, but it's also virtual, and that they are quintessentially untranslatable. Like the ashes in Mal d'Archives or Feu la Cendre, the bodies of dream words are traces of an absolute singularity that can never be replaced or recovered. And it's also worth noting that Derrida's invocation of the idioms in works apparently unrelated to his reading of Heidegger often appeared to bear the ghostly imprint or the schlag of his encounter with Heidegger in the Geschlecht III series. And this is what struck me most of all. So if you go as far as you can, to almost to the polar opposite, to think of magnetic poles, from the reading of Heidegger, that's to say, to Derrida's writing on Hélène Cixous, in Fourmis, a little text called Ants, for example, a small semi-improvised text from 1991, Derrida invokes the same three terms together in the same way, language, idiom, and translation, as part of a call for thinking about sexual difference as a question of reading. And the title, Fourmis, written in the plural, comes from a word for a masculine ant that appeared in a dream to Hélène Cixous, and that she reported to Derrida on the telephone. Okay, so, and although Derrida never overtly mentions either Heidegger or the term Geschlecht in Fourmis, in ants, in his elaboration of Cixous' idiomatic expressions, he alludes, or he kind of reenacts, the precise lexicon of Geschlecht as he describes how Hélène Cixous' inventive dreamlike works are pretty much untranslatable, à peu près intraduisibles, because they are composed of so many idiomatic expressions, words and phrases, autant d'expressions de mots et de phrases idiomatiques that are, quote, only to be read, deciphered in the depths of an infinite familiarity, au fond de la familiarité même. And so we have this family word of familiarity, formidable as sexual difference itself. Formidable comme la différence sexuelle elle-même. So what happens? So in other words, that's one way of talking about idiom in Derrida's writing. So what happens then to Derrida's idiom as he approaches the question of Heidegger's idiom in Geschlecht III? And before even moving into the text of Geschlecht III, we can make the following observations. In reading Heidegger through translation, Derrida actively takes up the position of the foreigner, the stranger, as he approaches Heidegger's reading of Tockel. And throughout Geschlecht III, and perhaps throughout all of his readings of Heidegger, Derrida stages a reading of Heidegger as a scene that takes place on the threshold of Heidegger's text. On the one hand, or with one foot, he enters Heidegger's text and follows him closely, while on the other, with another foot, he refuses to enter Heidegger's house, hovering at the threshold, speaking with a foreign tongue and from the position of the foreigner who refuses to say foreign, fremd, only in German. And where Heidegger situates his encounter with Tockel as, quote, as an essential, quote, dialogue between thinking and poetry that draws upon the distinctive, though in each case different, relation to language that is proper to them both, Derrida situates his encounter with Heidegger by insisting on reading Heidegger with a French ear that remains attuned to Heidegger's relentless appeal to a unifying idiom that, he will ultimately argue, is in direct communication with nationality, as Rodrigo told us, national language, regardless of Heidegger's arguments to the contrary. And I think Rodrigo made a very powerful case for that a minute ago. Part 3, the idiom and the unspoken. There's also something particularly strange about Derrida's use of the word idiom in Geschlecht III. From the very beginning, as he glosses Heidegger's very first steps on the way toward his discussion with Tockel, Derrida calls upon the word idiom to translate Heidegger's language into his, that is Derrida's, own idiom. So where Heidegger says simply, quote, that every great poet creates his poetry out of one single poetic statement only, Derrida repeatedly invokes the word idiom. So the word idiom is Derrida's word, a term which is absent from Heidegger's text, as he quotes, paraphrase, and comments on Heidegger's inaugural critical claim. So he says, the fact is that Heidegger does not intend here to situate the idiom in general, but this idiom here, that of the poet and of a given great poet. Tockel, great poet, these are his words. Every great poet, so now that's Derrida now quoting Heidegger. Every great poet, jeder große Dichter, is a poet only, Dichter nur, on the basis of the dictation of a unique saying aus einem einzigen Gedicht. The unique marks the site in its individual singularity, the absolute and inimitable propriety of an idiom. In the absolute uniqueness of its idiom, the Gedicht is never said, it remains unspoken. So I just wanted to point out here that Derrida uses the word idiom no fewer than 4 times in this short passage. And he begins by acknowledging the distinction between what he calls the idiom in general, presumably national language, and the unique poetic idiom that, according to Heidegger, is what makes a poet uniquely great. But where Heidegger appears to emphasize the reciprocity and reversibility between the einzige Gedicht, the uniqueness of a single poetic statement, and its essential unspokenness, the poetic statement remains unsaid, das Gedicht bleibt ungesprochen, Derrida emphasizes the word einzigen, unique, only, lone, single, which he claims marks the site of its indivisible singularity, le propre absolu, and inevitable of an idiom. So if you look at it, you can see what happens. And I was sort of struck in this passage by the way that Derrida does not remark the way the sound of the word ein, one, is repeated twice in the very phrase, aus einem einzigen Gedicht. So it's kind of a double mark there of the one. But that is perhaps, we can think about whether or not that would be interesting. But in Derrida's exposition, the single word, idiom, simultaneously translates 3 different terms in Heidegger's text, 1, Gedicht, poetic statement. 2, Einzigen, unique, sole, and lone. And 3, ungesprochen, unsaid. Thereby establishes a univocal direct line of communication between those three terms. And moreover, as we saw earlier, because the term idiom bears within it a fundamental relation to what remains untranslatable, Derrida's insistence on supplying a word, so here he puts in the word idiom, to translate the poetic statement that must, for Heidegger, remain unspoken, that is, wordless, is itself significant. So where Heidegger does not have a word for this unspoken thing because it's unspoken, Derrida has supplied a word, and the word is idiom for that which is unspoken. So this is important for several reasons. The introduction of the term idiom enables Derrida to argue that the relation between the Gedicht and the ungesprochen is not only unique, but is also absolutely indivisible, proper, and inimitable. And 2, from this point forward, Derrida explicitly appeals to the idiom as the very name for the signposts that will guide him along the various way stations on Heidegger's path. And he says, nous continuons à suivre ce cheminement en marquant des stations auprès des lieux où l'idiome joue un rôle déterminant, destinant justement. So we are continuing to follow this movement along the path by marking stations near places where the idiom plays a role that is determining, destining precisely. So idiom, where Derrida locates idiom, is how he's going to move through, how he's going to see Heidegger's movement through Trakl. So Derrida's gloss of the term idiom in the passage quoted above sets up his important subsequent claim that the silence of the unspoken poetic statement is a silence that is uniquely bound to the idiomatic specificity of the German language. And Derrida writes, the site of the I'm going to read the French because this is before we have the official translation. So you can look at it, but it's not as good as the translation that's coming. Il faut bien que le lieu du Gedicht imprononcé, s'il n'est pas autre chose que ce à quoi il donne source, soit essentiellement apparenté dans son silence même à l'idiome allemand, voix haut et vieil allemand. Son silence est allemand, il parle allemand. So, according to Derrida, the silence that Heidegger ascribes to Trakl's poetry is not actually a silence at all. And I think Rodrigo Teresa has also written about this. The silence not only speaks, it speaks German, Old High German. We note in passing Derrida's use of the French word apparenté, with all its familial connotations, to describe the relation between the unspoken Gedicht and the idiom of the German language. Another way of understanding the consequences of Derrida's claim that the ungesprochen Gedicht speaks German is to say that for Derrida, the prefix un in Heidegger's word ungesprochen is already on the way to gathering itself into the indivisibility of the ein that Derrida finds so troubling in Heidegger's reading of Trakl's expression ein Geschlecht. In other words, as soon as one can affirm that the ungesprochen speaks a particular, unique, and identifiable idiom, the force of the German prefix un is neutralized, and it comes to function more like an ein. But how then ought we to think about the prefix un in the word ungesprochen? The un is not simply a negation. As Derrida himself reminds us, the un of the unspoken should not be understood as a Freudian repression, denial, or interdiction, but rather as the source of a rhythmic wave. The un in the word ungesprochen is therefore not opposed to speech, but rather indicates a place prior to speech and a promise of speech that continues to be born and carried in what is spoken. And this understanding of the un in ungesprochen as bearing the mark of that which has come before but has not yet arrived establishes a link between the words ungesprochen and the striking word das Ungeborene, unborn, that plays such a critical role in Heidegger's reading of Togl. The link between the two un words also returns us to Derrida's reading of Heidegger's idiomatic use of the words tragen, to carry, and austragen, meaning among other things, meaning among other things to carry a child to term. In a long commentary on the figure of Elissa, the boy in Togl's poetry who died too soon, Derrida shows how Heidegger's account of the promise of a future for humankind, uncorrupted by the degenerate sexuality of Geschlecht, relies upon his idiomatic use of the words tragen and austragen. And beginning with a sentence of Heidegger's, which he then comments, Derrida explains how the words tragen and austragen are intimately bound up with Heidegger's thinking of time and difference. And this adolescent, I'm going to read the English, even though it's not the most polished translation. We're waiting for the good one. This adolescent thus unfolds the human essence and faltet das Menschenwesen in advance forward towards, voraus, the beginning or the departure on begin of what has not yet come to term, noch nicht zum Tragen gekommen. To carry, here tragen, has of course the sense of producing, of bearing in the sense of production, but you will see that the word communicating, which the French translation completely misses, with on the one hand austragen, which means to carry in the sense of a child, carrying a child before its birth and up to its birth. Ein austragenes Kind is a child born at term, carried to term, and on the other hand with a word that belongs to Heidegger's idiom. I mean that Heidegger has appropriated what he says of difference, especially in the text that precedes this one in On the Way to Language, Unterwegs zu Sprache, Language, die Sprache, where the words austragen comes to say something essential about Unterschied, difference. Difference, Unterschied, in its uniqueness and its intimacy is what unites the diaphora and what carries to term, having carried from one end to the other, der Durchtrage, der Austrag. Here, Ellis, the dead stranger, quote, unfolds in advance with the human essence toward that which has not yet arrived at its term, what has not yet been carried, noch nicht zum Tragen gekommen. And Heidegger adds in parentheses, Old German, geboren, therefore, what is not yet born, unborn, ungeborene. Okay. So picking up on what he calls the Heideggerian idiom through the words tragen and austragen, Derrida compares the way Heidegger uses the lexicon of childbearing to think about difference, Unterschied, in his first essay on Togl, Die Sprache, language, to his deployment of that same lexicon in Die Sprache im Gedicht, language in the poem. We can observe, and this is implied by what Derrida says, although he does not make the point explicitly, that the language of carrying and gestation that Heidegger adopts within each of the two Togl essays is played out between the two essays as well. Thus, Heidegger's second essay on Togl, language in the poem, carries or bears within it the language of carrying that Heidegger had carried to term in his first essay, in his earlier essay, language. And moreover, as we saw much earlier on, in the passage quoted by Derrida in Geschlecht IV, where Heidegger describes how things thing the world, in the essay called Language, Heidegger uses the idioms associated with Austrag in order to think Unterschied, difference, in relation to that which is carried to term. In apparent contrast, in the later essay, Language in the Poem, Heidegger once again draws upon the childbearing resonances of the idioms associated with Austrag. But here, he consistently invokes them in the negative, that is, in relation to incomplete gestation, childbearing that was not carried to term. In Language in the Poem, Heidegger's use of idiomatic language connoting not yet born becomes even more amplified as it is instantiated and doubled by the actual poetic figure of the unborn that Heidegger finds in Togl's poems. And moreover, as Derrida points out, the figure of the unborn from the later essay links in complete gestational time to the earliest time. That's why it's so important. To the earliest time, a time that remains before us in both senses. It is before us because it is earlier and because it is yet to be. For this reason, the gestational time of the unborn is both the time of the promise and the promise of a time that could open a future that would not be conceived according to a vulgar conception of time. The very conditions of the possibility of this future require that the figure of Elissa, the one who died too early, be joined to that of the early time, the earliest time of the unborn. And in so doing, Heidegger recasts death as birth and the unborn as generating the true time of the future. And the un of the unborn, like the un of the ungesprochen, is not a simple negation. It is a temporal inflection. The unborn is not birth, it is another birth, or birth otherwise, freed, apparently, from the vulgar conceptions of time and from the corrosive effects of corrupted sexual difference, according to Heidegger. So we have arrived at a place where birth without birth, unbirth, we might say, has been severed from any relation to a mother or maternal figure, apart from the fact that the words tragen and austragen both belong to a shared family of words that is intimately related to childbearing. And from everything we have said, it should become clear why there could be no mother in this scene of birth. This is so for at least several reasons. One, as only the unborn can carry the promise of the earliest time, only the non-vulgar temporality of the unborn can emancipate birth from its traditional confines within facticity, biology, and biological time. And two, the word mother would seem to belong to the corrupted Geschlecht, marked by corrupted sexuality, discordant sexual difference, away from which Heidegger is attempting to move. And three, the mother might have a place in anthropology, biology, or genealogy, perhaps even psychology, but there is no place for the mother in thinking. This is what Heidegger's text appears to conclude. But as I reach my own conclusion, I would like to suggest that carried within Heidegger's two Trockel essays, there are traces of another way of thinking about the place of the mother, perhaps in non-anthropological, non-biological terms, that emerges through Heidegger's elaboration of the language of childbearing, the place of language, and language as place. The mother in question here is neither simply natural, nor human, nor perhaps even recognizable as a mother. And I think I have to worry about this point. There's a problem with my thinking here, but we'll see if you guys come up with what's wrong with it, but what I think might be wrong with it, but I'll just go with what I have. However, this non-human, non-natural maternal thinking calls for a thinking of the maternal as a place of receptive, painful difference that could challenge Heidegger's account of sexual difference as it becomes gathered into ein Geschlecht. The mother in question is a speaking stone that Heidegger says is pain itself. Pain, explains Heidegger, is the animator of life. Pain is the animator of life. Pain is what gives life to life. In being pain, the stone becomes the mother of language. The stone carries the language of pain from the earliest dawn, the time before time. The stone becomes stone by receiving the pain of language and by bearing it. It's this gestational figure. The stone holds, joins, separates, gathers. This gathering, however, does not gather into one. It cannot be figured as the point at the end of a spear. And although Derrida does not speak about the speaking stone himself, his writings give us a way of reading it. And from this perspective, following Derrida, perhaps the place of the mother in Geschlecht III calls for another thinking of the mother as place, similar to the way that Derrida develops in relation to the question, to this question in Cora. Geschlecht III would then entail a thinking of something like a triton genos, a third Geschlecht. As I don't have time to develop this thought here, I will end by citing Heidegger as he becomes the bearer of the language of pain carried in the old stone. Pain I'll read the English and you have the German. Pain conceals itself, verbirgt sich in the stone, the petrifying pain that delivers itself into the keeping of the impenetrable rock, in whose appearance there shines forth its ancient origin out of the silent glow of the first dawn, the earliest dawn, which, as the prior beginning, is coming toward everything that is becoming and brings to it the advent, never to be overtaken, of its essential being. The old stones are pain itself, for pain looks earthily upon mortals. The colon after the word stone signifies that now the stone is speaking. Pain itself has the word. Silent since long ago, it now says to the wanderers who follow the stranger nothing less than its own power and endurance. Truly, I shall forever be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Elissa.
I have a question about the idiom. To what extent would you sign on to the idea that an idiom is a life, that it bears the receptivity or something like the receptivity that you were talking about the living being having in acquiring an idiom? Because the dictation language made me think immediately of the hedgehog. I had never made the connection before from the what is poetry essay. The little being, the little animal curled up, hiding its unspoken secret.
I don't know that I would sign on to that exactly. I mean, I do know at Princeton when I gave this at Princeton, and this paper was already pretty long, but I might have quoted the famous pornographic passage from What is a Relevant Translation, about translation in the idiom of the tongue that catches, the fire at the caress of the tongue. We can look it up, and that in that case, there is something like an animation, but I'm not sure that animation necessarily has to be anything as recognizable exactly as a life as in an animal life. So there is an idiom is it's a site of resistance, and I mean, here again we can talk and we can think about it. It's something I've been trying to do for some time but haven't been able to, but to press a little bit harder on Derrida's use of the verb to dream, and what happens in the name of dreaming. And so he dreams of this or he dreams of that, and I think it's not an accident that one of the first strong articulations of the problem of the idiom is in, I say first, but maybe it's not first, but it is a strong articulation of the idiom, is in Freud and the Scene of Writing, at that problem of dream words. So that, and why that's important has to do with what the relationship between dream language would be and national language, as it were, or because it both is and it isn't, or community, or what gathers. I mean, because dream language participates in national language, but it also doesn't.
We have a whole queue of questions. So, I'm sorry, am I cutting you off?
No.
Okay, let's go Teresa, then Ian, Alberto, Michael, David, in that order.
Really quick then. Well, thank you. Very, very interesting. And I was thinking, so the unborn, the stillborn, obviously also relates to the undead. No? And I was thinking when you were pointing to this third year that Derrida is talking about, that with this third year, actually we may hear, he says in Geschlecht II, we may hear the voice of the friend, Heidegger's friend, which he proposes might be Nietzsche. And Nietzsche said also when he was very young that
the tiny ear?
Yes.
Is the feminine tiny ear?
Is the High German, the Old German, that it's the mother tongue. People think it's dead, and it is not dead. It's kind of undead, I would say, because he wants to bring it. And then he wants to bring it forward with huge discipline. And that would be the law of the dead father. Derrida points that Nietzsche says. No? So then we have this kind of very ambivalent and tense situation of wanting to bring semi-dead mother language because it is the only living language that's possible for this future. And if not, okay, so let's discipline the youth, and then it says, let's speak Latin, which is like inferior, you know. So all this was resonating to me because it's Derrida, the ones that brings it forward for us, no. And then when you were saying, you know, these Latin terms that he uses and all related to this nationality, etc., that are Gaslat too. You know? So just comment.
Yeah, I mean, at one point I thought I was going to title part of this, but it's very difficult, that first part of Geschlecht IV about the call and the ear, and I think I was going to call it, like, you know, where he talks about the figure of the ear, but the ear is more like a surrogate womb too. So, I mean, there's something about that ear, or its bions, it's like a kind of prosthetic because of what it has to carry. What you've said is super interesting, and I can't totally process it enough, so I can just thank you for the comment and think more about it. I think the Nietzsche-Heidegger, I think the Nietzsche-Derrida connection is pretty interesting. There.
Because Derrida makes it very clear. You know, One
thing that is bizarre, though, is I can say, and I don't mean to be rude to Derrida here, but in the discussion session of the ear of the other, there is someone, and I don't mean to be rude to that person either, there's a French philosopher who asks him about the quote that I just quoted to you from the third ear, because Derrida says the third ear, and he asks him about the passage from Nietzsche, and Derrida clearly does not know that passage. And so, like, he asked him specifically, how do you relate that third ear to Nietzsche's third ear? And Derrida just doesn't know it. That itself is, I mean, that's interesting because he's picked it up, and I think he may have gotten it also that, you know, from Sarah Kaufman and from other people who were talking about it, there was a way that he was listening to something, but that particular link he doesn't know.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to ask about another mother haunting Trockel's poetry, and perhaps Heidegger's essays on Trockel as well, namely the Virgin Mother, Mary. And I mean, Derrida notes this in Geschlecht III. He's very perturbed by Heidegger's disavowal, you could say, of the Christian current in Trockel's poetry. And then there's the reference Heidegger makes, you know, Heidegger's not referring to Jesus in his final two poems because the sister appears, and Derrida says...
And the sister could be Christ.
The sister could be Christ's mother.
Right.
And it seems like there's a possible parallel with what you're saying, right? So neither simply natural nor human. You even think about the Immaculate Conception, you know, think about the Virgin Mother's mother. Well, she's not exactly recognizable as a mother. This seems to be operative throughout the text. Possibly there's a kind of pain there. Yes, in Christianity, this pain, this agony of Christ is redeemed effectively. So I guess I'm just curious to hear about this mother that does seem kind of present in its absence in Heidegger's reading.
Well, first I would say that the Virgin Mother is the undecidable link between the ontic and the ontological. I mean, between the kind of the problem of the mother as an anthropological figure and as carrying some other relation to being or something else, in like the function of the Virgin Mary goes beyond mothering or birth in any normal human. She is a figure for something of birth that is of another order, and so she is and she isn't a mother, and it's in the way that she isn't a mother that she can only be the mother of Christ, or perhaps that perhaps she incarnates what's happening with motherhood all over. I will say though, and this I was saying to Stephanie Harris last night at dinner, but I also said at Princeton, and I feel really kind of strange about saying this. Okay, this will get me onto my other hobby horse, which is, and perhaps you can help, because I'm an amateur in this zone. And when I walked into looking at Heidegger and Trockel, I looked into all kinds of literary critical readings of Trockel. And Trockel, the version of Trockel you'll find over here is about as different of the version of Trockel that you'll find from Heidegger, beginning with the fact that he had a known incestuous relationship with his sister that produced a child, and there were abortions, and there's all of this figure of corrupted incest, that they wanted to go to South America, that the sister wanted to go to South America where they could live and nobody would know that they were brother and sister, so et cetera, and that but also, which is marked, and this to me is the elephant in the room of Heidegger's whole reading, that Trockel apparently got the term Geschlecht from Otto Weininger and from Charakter und Geschlecht, and that so that if you have a thinking of racial eugenics and sexual difference and crazy femininity that you're getting from a self-hating Jew of Weininger, which was if you said Geschlecht in an Austrian context at a certain time, this would be the immediate set of connotations that would come up. And so you see this word that would be so loaded, for a particular German-speaking audience at a particular time. That was, and that Heidegger has to tell us Geschlecht, Old German, Schlag, Schlagen, the first and the second Schlag, and you're thinking, seriously, dude? What memory trace or what repression has to happen at that point? Because that was not just any word. That was a word that was in cultural circulation because of a discourse about race, generation, etc., sexuality, and incest. So I kind of can't reconcile. I imagine that Heidegger knew perfectly well. Heidegger knows that he's unwriting that history when he's writing it. But what's curious to me, how none of that gets talked about. And then you're told that, when I brought this to different people, because I felt in that children's book, Are You My Mother? Can we talk about Heidegger the Austrian? Heidegger the Austrian, Trockel the Austrian, and then people accuse you of going into regional and, going into the anthropological, the sociological, and Heidegger's essay is not about that. But maybe it is, maybe Heidegger's essay is also about that.
Well, thank you. That was a really provocative and rich talk. And I have at least two sets of comments that I would like to keep very brief. But I think Heidegger knew all of this. And he was rewriting it because it was so important to him. In other words, you talked about the first track, let's say, the language. He's rewriting the notion of ontological difference.
Yeah.
The notion of Unterschied is hugely important.
Yeah.
So he's placing that in connection with reading track. And in the 50s, so after the war and after. So I think that all of these, the texts are very over-determined because they were so important. So this leads me to one of the things I wanted to mention. Because when we talk about national humanism, it's not just Fichte, but also Hegel that is at the stake here, okay? And we remember in the philosophy of right, the present state as the prime example of an accomplished state in world history. Well, we know it from philosophy of history that everything ends in the Prussian state, and we know from phenomenology that the form of the infinite is a German thing. So he's talking about Hegel, and he is obviously trying to go beyond Hegel, trying to leave Hegel behind. So this is something that we need to take into account. This comes already from the 64-65 seminar. Heidegger can be understood to be against all of that, from that perspective, okay? Against Fichte, against Hegel, against absolute idealism, and against a particular notion of the West as the end of history. And I am remembering, perhaps because there is this book right here, the passages in Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, which was an important book for him, where Kierkegaard talks about leaving behind the ethics, leaving behind the ethical at all, completely, in order to recuperate or to assume an absolute relation to the absolute. Now, this notion of the absolute relation to the absolute, you made me think of this because of your explication of the idiom Gedicht connection. Now, this is, of course, for Kierkegaard, the function of the knight of faith, to recover against the ethical, which is a fallen state, a lower state, the higher absolute relation to the absolute, which is absolutely singular, idiomatic, and ungesprochen. Can only be ungesprochen. Abraham. Abraham is the main guy here. So that's one thing. I think that this is important because of it kind of rewrites the whole connection with national humanism, it seems to me. But the other thing is another word that comes up at the end of the Heidegger's second essay on track, which is also mysterious, like Schmerz, you brought up pain. The other one is the Riss, rift, or fissure.
Yeah.
I think it is also very important for the maternal.
Yes, it is, yeah.
François Dastur makes a big deal out of risk because he says this is separation and gathering, okay?
At once, yeah.
At once, okay?
On the threshold, that's in Sprache?
Yeah, the threshold and the stone and all of that. This is precisely not Versammlung in the
that was why I was sort of saying that in the that Heidegger, had said that it seems strange to me that Heidegger actually needs to go to that Eingeschlecht, given that he had it going on in the Speak in Stone. But that's neither here nor there. But
and then I think this Freud, at least I think it is in Das Unheimliche, where he talks about the connection between anxiety, angst, and the vaginal channel.
Yeah, okay. Well, I spend a lot of my time there.
Okay.
On that last one, that's a kind of neighborhood I'm very familiar with. About Freud, I just wanted to throw it here for future discussion here, which was the other bee in my bonnet from about the discussions that we've had so far about Geschlecht III that is still bothering me, is the sexuality in what is the sexuality in sex? So, and we know that we're going to the kinder, to the incest of the two that would be the kinder and the gentler two, and does go back to this childhood, this period of latency. And so there was something I wanted to think about of what kind of sexuality that would actually still be sexual is left by the time Heidegger's done working over his notion. Geschlecht doesn't necessarily mean sexuality, but given that we have the fallen, given that we have everything that goes on with the dissensus, there is the problem of sexuality in there.
So you're working with the idea of thinking of the notion of the mother here. By that time it was published in France, Nicolas Harman book about the instinct filial, about the relationship between the mother and a non-anthropological understanding of the humanization process. And then she just laid it down. Maria Toro was working with him too, and I don't know if you're familiar with that idea process. I'm
familiar with Maria Toro, but who is the?
Nicolas Harman. Belonged to the Hungarian secondary school, and they tried to mediate between an anthropological and philosophical notion of humanity, but coming out of this archetypical, subconscious understanding of the breaking with the mother as the breaking with the tree, and the falling from the tree as a process of humanization. And there is actually the comments of them. It seems to me it disappeared in the Point on Suspension, a series of interviews, I believe in English.
Yes.
Well, the whole topic is the mother, is the relation to the mother.
We have questions by Michael and then David.
So I was curious about one of your comments near the end of your talk. I thought it was very interesting. I thought it was really great. Thank you. And that was where you described the mother as a type of place. Did I understand that correctly? Could you go a little bit more in depth here? Is it the mother is a type of place, or that the relationship of motherhood or the kind of relationship to natality, that is a type of place? I totally understand what it would mean for the mother to become a place in the strict Heideggerian sense.
In a strict Heideggerian sense,
Maybe.
probably not. In terms of the paper that I gave here, it was kind of what Alberto was just saying.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that there is, and it would be the way that Heidegger describes the threshold. And the threshold is like between here, like that which it both brings together and separates. So it's a drawing together that isn't a drawing together around a part. But what he says is that the stone becomes stone by the bearing of a pain that then, yes, is petrified, actually becomes place. And so, so it's the trace of the bearing of a receptivity in that sense, but that place would not necessarily be present or self-present. So, I mean, it's not,
Sure. So is that kind of presence, is that in the mother or in
it would be a figure of mothering without a mother. I mean, on some sense, we don't have the anthropological figure, except to the degree that one could argue we also always do, because there is no birth without another that comes before us and that establishes that togetherness and that separation. And that there would be a way of thinking that relation of gestation or gestationality or of two-ness that perhaps need not subscribe to every single one of the anthropological designates that we have when we think of what culture gives to the figure of the mother and the child. So, so that there would be a way of thinking that oneness or that two-ness, and you can think of Lucy Irigaray if you want. You could think of, you could think in different ways about that, but you could also think of stone and threshold, is what I'm saying in this pain or this, because what I'm interested in is, even for there to be Schlagen, there has to be something that can receive the imprint, and there has to be impressionability, and that impressionability has to have some kind of, has to be, this was something, I haven't heard Katie's paper yet, but I'm asking it to her already yet, is there's a reversible formula that Derrida says about, he says, le coup fait le mal, et le mal fait un coup. And he is asked, and that a blow is a blow of pain. So that even in the first schlag, there is pain, and pain, part of what it's going to do in frayage, in that Derridian sense, is, even if it's is involved with something like pain and a receptivity to pain. And if you think of pain, and what's kind of curious, in the way that Heidegger speaks of Schmerz, it's not a moral, it's not a moral thing, and that's what becomes so interesting about the Tuschlagen. And this, I have to say, I'm really dumb about this Tuschlagen, because, in myself, I know I am, because we go from, I kind of don't understand how we get to the corrupted and the evil and the second Schlag, and I can never go there. I just get lost at that point. But we go from that receptivity of pain to the second Schlag, and that's dissensus, and that's everything goes to hell, and it's corruption, and it's sexual difference, and then we find women and sex.
Thank you. Thanks. Before we get to David, I'm going to interrupt for 1 second. This reversibility of the formula, right? Le coup fait le mal est un coup, right? That's the undecidable moment of birth, unless I'm mistaken, or something about precisely the impossibility of saying what comes first, whether there was event of birth. It seems to me that that would be one locale that we could locate.
I don't know. That's interesting. That was not what I had in mind. It's you know, it's impressionability. It's what retains a trace. Maybe.
But something like, well, okay. Thank you.
I had a question and a comment having to do with this set of motifs that I really appreciated how you linked together: the idiom, dream, and this question and cinder. And I agree with you about this sort of interesting double movement in Derrida about this sort of constant insistence or disavowal that I would never say something's absolutely untranslatable. I'd never say something's absolutely, and then of course, you know, he very much does and go along that line. And then I wanted to ask, and you had alluded that if you think about something absolutely unsubstitutable, you're kind of not thinking of a trace, you're thinking of something that doesn't have the possibility of being repeated. And and then the cinder it's even more tracey than the trace, right? Because of that, it's the proper trace. And so my question is can you really respond to that part of Derrida by saying, not saying you do this, but just in general, by saying, well, that's not possible, something not iterable, that's not possible. Could you say, well, I'm dreaming of it, it must have some sort of effectivity or existence. I don't know how one would say it, but and then if something like an absolute idiom or a non-iterable cinder or something like that does exist in Derrida, my comment would be maybe what we were talking about earlier about the political distinction between Heidegger and Derrida as hanging sort of on a Derrida doesn't have an untranslatable or substitutable thing. Heidegger has German. Maybe that difference blurs a little bit. I don't know.
Well, I can say that, David, you're thinking about all the questions that I've been thinking of. So you're on the zone. You've reiterated some of the things I've been thinking, and I don't know exactly what I think, but I do think, I do think that by following this track of the idiom and Derrida's different ways of writing the idiom, that there would be a difference between what he's locating in Heidegger and what he himself is doing. And that would also, though, come to a different way of even thinking about what language and trace are. So that where Heidegger, and that's where the body of the word, that is something that is a different kind of a claim than a body of a word, even the body of a word as it appears in the language of the dream, is a different kind of a claim from saying this is in our Old High German.
Right, yeah.
And that there are different forms of transmission and inheritance and capital and patriarchy and all of that would go along those different modes of transmission. And even, I mean, that's what I was trying to argue, that even the fact that would work, that everything that I was saying about the untranslatable idiom is not against translation. It's sort of for the necessity of translation on some level. And so that if I began by saying Derrida reads Heidegger through translation to bring out something in the German through translation, because there's something untranslatable, that's already a very different gesture in relation to nationality in the idiom than the one that Rodrigo was speaking about this morning. So that there would be, that's kind of...
I think we have one short comment or question from Rodrigo, and then we'll break for lunch.
Thanks, Elissa. This is, I think, a question that has been haunting me since the Princeton conference. And you will remember that this one essay, the first Trakel essay, Die Sprache, it seems to be an essay that Heideggerians are very proud of. Exactly. And they pull to say, here's Heidegger saying that Unterschied is great, that Versammlung includes difference, and it's where this notion of pain is articulated. And I'm wondering, to Freud and Derrida, if I can accuse you of
You can
being those
accuse
things.
me of being those things.
Isn't it fishy to talk about
You were
a tranquilized pain and this nice versammlung that is just going to incorporate difference? Don't you find that fit? I mean, you said that it's interesting, but I'm tempted to think that
it's a disavowal.
it's not going to do.
No, I don't think it's going to, I don't, no, I would agree with you. I'm not saying it, I mean, I'm not enough of a Heideggerian to weigh in on, on the Heideggerian things, but I think, is it going to do? I don't know. The fact that got, the job that it does and that gets forgotten in Die Sprache in Gedicht, I think is symptomatic, because whatever is problematic about that fishiness, which we could go back, certainly becomes like the end of Die Sprache in Gedicht is way, 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 way more fishy. When we get to that brothers song and that gathering and that, and the Tuschlagen. So one could, along the lines you're going, take my whole reading and say, you want to know where that fishiness began? It began right back with that pain in that stone, and that made this whole process. That's what you needed to put in place and to get you to that brother. So I could imagine taking the whole thing I've done and transvaluing the values to emphasize something kind of sinister. What is interesting about it, though, is and you were the one who, much to the embarrassment of other people in my seminar, I think, had related the vocabulary of the Unterschied to the vagina.
Oh, right.
You were the one who located that. So if Heidegger talks about vaginas, it's in that essay. And there's, and that's partly where we get that birthing thing, because we don't just have the Tagen and Jauskagen, we have actual vaginas there. So, or actual words that, speak to that. And it is pretty interesting. Like I read I hope I'm not, again, insulting anybody, a very poor feminist philosophy student getting all excited about the fact that in that essay, Heidegger finally finds a feminine language, and that, he's gotten over all of his problems with National Socialism and bad politics and become a feminist. He's become Lucy Garay, by Die Sprache. So I don't actually know where I would come down at the end, but just to notice there's something happening in the language of sexuality, in particular feminine sexuality, around that schmerz and that pain, that is doing a lot of work, that then one could see that how to read that work, I don't know.
What's the opposite of fishy?
See what?
What's the opposite of fishy?
Fishy was...
The opposite of fishy.
Thank you, Elissa. We'll have about 45 minutes for lunch, which is served or semi-served outside, and then we'll reconvene.
So, Jeff, this is